Hey guys, welcome back to the Laurence McKenna podcast, or the podcast on the Laurence McKenna channel. It's good to have you. If you're interested in what we've covered in this podcast and you don't want to hit subscribe yet, it's okay. But you can if you want to. Jamie and I went through Manchester United. We broke down why they are good, also what isn't right at Manchester United right now. Bruno Fernandes, the people at the very top of the club, Erik Ten Hag, why Tottenham played particularly well against them, and also what we think Manchester United need to do or where they need to change in order to move forward. We're not here to be this kind of explainer channel where we just want to kind of put thoughts out there and then you don't do anything. We're interested in hearing your thoughts. So hit the comment button down below or hit subscribe if you've not already hit it, and let us know what your thoughts are on Manchester United. There'll be plenty more chats this season. Please do get in the comments below and enjoy the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast. It's good to have you guys, and it's also good to have Jamie Slevin. Thanks a lot for coming.
Laurence, hey mate.
It's good to have you. Thanks for discussing this, because I feel like this is a weird one to unpack and like maybe a bit of a tired subject, but also a subject that you can just really get your teeth into. It's Manchester United. They lost again on the weekend. Again, that kind of away record that they had last season continues. But already in the first sentence that I've covered this, I'm throwing out more Manchester United tropes. And I guess I'm interested in unpacking Manchester United, but also how we tell the story of Manchester United over and over again. And every time we try and come up, and this is very much something I've done on previous channels I've been on and in all sorts of places, you come up with a new headline and you almost like retrofit it to Manchester United to try and make that, that's what's wrong. Well, if they solve that, then they're 50% of the way there, right? And I think there's like I guess what I'm interested in Manchester United is like, they've become something that it's a mystery in modern football as to exactly where things are going wrong. We've got ideas and hunches, but there's something off. Do you know what I mean?
Man United has become this like glob of problems.
Right.
And it's all about levels of analysis. So on the top end, you can say, well, look, it's the ownership and the culture, and they're not innovative in any of the ways. They've only recently put in a director of football, etc. But that doesn't explain Saturday in midfield or yesterday in midfield.
Right. So you're talking about separating off-field board or off-field management level with on-field decisions. And I think how those two are linked, but it's like the rope that links the two of those is like on either end of that is got two different people pulling up different ways, and they don't know where the other one's going. So and they have to somehow solve this saw machine to keep themselves alive.
Right, and the problem, and this is a little bit meta with analysing this stuff,
right,
is it's totally cool to point out the link, and the link clearly exists, but you lose all the detail. Because we're going to talk, obviously, a little bit about their game at Spurs, and Ten Hag making this decision on who plays next to Casemiro, etc. And it's kind of naff in that context to say, well, the Glazers take money out the club. And they absolutely do. So I think the point about the analysis that gets missed with Man United is quite often it's not obvious whether you're talking about the high-level issues at the top, and you end up just saying something therefore like, well, this is Manchester United.
This is Manchester United we're talking about here is one of my favourite phrases of all time, just because I can't remember who it was who did that, but it was such a great sketch, and he just keeps saying over it. There's a guy online does a sketch, and it's like he keeps just going, this is Manchester United we're talking about here. This is, of course, Manchester United we're talking about here. And for a while, I just remember like an obsessive 8-year-old who'd heard someone say a funny joke, like I'd do it over and over and over again, like an idiot.
Yeah, and then the other pundits who are like, he's also playing, going,
yeah,
but this is Manchester United.
This is Manchester. No, but yeah. And do you know what that kind of tells? Like the three parts that I break it down to are, there are four. They're actually, so there's three that surround what I think is the actual core of what's going on here, right? So one, on the field issues at Manchester United. Those are unavoidable. We're obviously trying to unpack those, right? If you're not winning the league at Manchester United, there is an issue. It's probably the biggest football club in England still, and I say that as a Liverpool fan. Secondly, off the field issues, which are ownership, board level stuff, though if you look at the names on the board, something's off because you're like, these names should work. And thirdly, the way the story is told, and we keep coming back to this over and over and over again on our podcast, is like, it's a theme that I'm really interested in this season. We kept thinking in even 20 years ago, I had this idea of journalists being these like neutral parties that like told the story and I'm just stating facts here, sort of thing. But around Manchester United, there's so much muddying of the water, or it's not muddying of the water. You can't even see the water for what's going on because you don't know who is in the club and supporting their on-the-field policy. You don't know who's against the on-the-field policy. You don't know who's against or for the spend policy. You don't know who wants to be an owner, who doesn't want to be an owner. You don't know who's for Ten Hag and was for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. You don't know, the long run of, should we just, Manchester United should be able to spend money before they sell players. They should not be thinking one in, one out. It should literally be, we know what our route is here. We know exactly where the on-field wants to go, and they continually misread the tea leaves. It would be my overall thing.
Yeah, so if you're trying to characterize Man United today in 2023, after they've lost to Spurs, you kind of have to start somewhere. And because of how muddy this is, on the one hand, you think, well, God, but Ten Hag's doing good, right? And on the other hand, you think, but they're spending lots. Should they be doing better? And you think, God, well, they're actually not spending that much.
But so in the context of overall football, there is a decent level of spend there, right? It's the context within which they spend that money and then the players they buy that you sort of go, what issues are you actually addressing here? How does it work when you buy Mason Mount, seemingly a fantastic football player, and then you don't solve the rest of the midfield issue? So the issue is people are going to go, Mason Mount doesn't fit in this midfield. I'm like, yeah, but they don't have the other pieces to make Mason Mount fit. So what we're then doing as the storytellers and as the journalists is people are going, oh, Mason Mount doesn't fit. He doesn't fit in the system because he's not that kind of player. He's not this kind of guy. I then go, well, what is the motivation for Ten Hag? What is the motivation for the people behind the scenes? It must be, hence why McTominay is frozen out, why other players are frozen out, why Fred went off for a ridiculously low fee in the first place. Obviously, they should have sold him for that fee now, but imagine the value that he could have had and what his potential was and how he could have been coached up to being, the best Brazilian in the league, potentially, all these kind of things. I'm just thinking around that. And I'm like, there is a series of little trips that are taking away from the velocity. So yeah, I keep coming up with stupid analogies, but it works.
Yeah, and to add to the stupid analogies, quite often on Instagram, I'll see these art reels. And you don't quite know what they're making right until the end.
Right.
So it looks kind of offbeat and kind of interesting, but it hasn't come together.
That's so true. So what you're saying is, so you watch the art thing and you're not quite sure whether you will be happy with what they're making in the end, but you're like, oh, what's he doing with that piece of card? Or like, oh, he's ripping up an old plastic bottle. This must be something interesting.
So for instance, yesterday Man United lose 2-0 to Tottenham, and they're crying out for someone in central midfield. And McTominay is sitting on the bench. So that's, in my mind, Ten Hag with a very clear, crystallized idea of where they want to go. And it clearly doesn't involve Scott McTominay. But when you're watching it, you're going, hang on, that's the obvious solution. Now, the issue I essentially have with Man United is they've spent big money, relatively speaking, but it's not obvious they've addressed the areas of the field that needs addressing. So if I can put specifics to that.
Go for it.
Look, they took 2 big gambles. Their names are Jadon Sancho and Anthony. They spent about 170 million quid between them, maybe a little bit more. And it's not obvious how they improved the side.
150.
I think
170 million euros, maybe.
That's
150 million quid. Doesn't sound right. Because I think I got 85 for Anthony or something like that. And then 75, 100. I'm splitting hairs, but I know. You know what I'm saying?
But it's a ton of money to spend on players. And I think
2 key players. If I look at the top 4, you offer me Jadon Sancho, possibly even you offer me Anthony. I think Liverpool probably take both those signings. Maybe not Anthony, but maybe at a push. Manchester City, they don't have someone on the right wing that can fulfill that necessarily when they get rid of Riyad Mahrez. Maybe they've sort of worked that out a little bit now, but I think they'd take Anthony and they definitely take Jadon Sancho, although at one point they didn't. I think Arsenal would take Jadon Sancho in a heartbeat. I think they've obviously got Saka out there, but if you took Saka out the equation, I think you'd probably look at that. Spurs would do the same. I can't think of a team until I get to a certain level where I go, I wouldn't take either of those.
And is that not the paradox? They're spending money on good players, then you watch them on a Saturday afternoon, and somehow it's not quite fitting. And the question is essentially this. Is it that the shape doesn't work? Or is it that, a little bit like Liverpool a few years ago, where they needed those 2 players to unlock the whole side? United are, in Ten Hag's eyes, a centre-forward who can keep the ball and like a ball-playing 4/6, away from all of a sudden Anthony making sense?
I do think that Anthony's fascinating. There's a few players in the Manchester United side who split a lot of people's opinions, if that makes sense. Bruno is the first one, because I know for a fact that a lot of Premier League players just do not like Bruno. Like, they have not pleasant things to say about him. I'm not sure he's the best.
What do you make of Bruno? Do you if I say, do you rate
People
Bruno?
know I rate him extremely highly in terms of his capability. He feels like that kid in school. Why do I keep doing analogies? He feels like that kid in school where it's like, your son is destined for straight A's at A level if he applies himself. And God, am I about to quote Joe Rogan? Like, I saw a quote the other day and it stuck with me. I don't watch a lot of Joe Rogan, but stick with me here. He was like, on a good day, sure, anyone can do good on their good day. It's the pushing through. It's the grit your teeth moments. It's when you're tired. It's when you're all these kind of things. I'm sure he's not the first person to say that, but I'm obviously got to attribute the quote to someone. It was Marcus Aurelius. I guess it's and there's going to be someone who feels very emotionally attached to Bruno Fernandes. There was a 7-0. He just completely lost it in that game, like absolutely lost it against Liverpool. And there were vibes which matched that in this Spurs, whatever it was, right?
And I think this calls into question, what is the function of a captain?
Yeah, totally. Who would you have made Manchester United captain? I know the name goes straight in my head as soon as I say Manchester United captain for this side. I'm not saying overall. I know it's Roy Keane. Or I would say
Varane.
Exactly the same name for me. Varane is the captain for me of this side. Do you know why? Because no one's going to dispute it. Because no one's going to go, maybe you could have chosen X. You have a small choice. You can't make it Onana. He's too new to the side. You can't make it Martinez because he's maybe too polarizing. You can't make it Luke Shaw because, again, he's too polarizing in recent years. You can't make it Aaron Wan-Bissaka because he may not always be in the side. Varane and Martinez, which is a great centre-back partnership, by the way, that's the only you can pick from those two. Casemiro, I think his long-term isn't secured at Manchester United. I mean, you'd obviously love him to stay at the club and it would be like, this was great. You won't get I don't think Casemiro will get a testimonial. His testimonial's in Madrid. Do you know what I mean?
And if you're going Casemiro, go Varane. For the exact same qualities that make Casemiro a captain, potentially.
Right. Mason Mount, no, too new. Garnacho, too young. Sancho, too young. Rashford, possibly too polarizing. Possibly, in Ten Hag's mind, maybe one of the players that in the long run, you go, could we upgrade that maybe? And I'm saying that in the nicest possible framing. Same with Anthony, but Bruno Fernandes was picked. Now, maybe Bruno Fernandes was picked for multiple different reasons, right? And I'm not saying I want to undermine those reasons. Someone who's choosing knows better than me. But from the outside, if you can openly pick holes, I feel like there's an issue there. Because there's other clubs where you go, of course.
So then my question to you is, if you have someone like Bruno Fernandes, who's possibly the most talented or second most talented player in that squad, how do you solve a problem like him? And I'm characterizing the problem as, at home, especially against weaker sides, he can look 9 out of 10. But away from home, especially at places like Anfield or Tottenham, he goes missing. How does Ten Hag have to think about that problem?
He doesn't even go missing. So here's the issue. It's about defining what he does, that's part of the problem, right? So we have to be very specific about our critical analysis of Bruno Fernandes, because here's where I think the crux of the conversation lands, right? Manchester United have been so sloppy, they've almost, the equivalent for me would almost be like a BBC type of equivalent, where it's gotten so big and there is so much going on at that club, and so many of those things are like propped up by a toothpick, and you're so many stuff where you're like, we've perfectly balanced that Chevrolet deal, don't touch it. That Adidas deal was working out really nicely for us. And that obviously Adidas offered a huge amount of money because Manchester United is a global club, right? That's great. But that's very precarious. Don't upset that. The Mason Greenwood thing. I'm saying a swear word on a podcast right now, but the Mason Greenwood situation, the way that was handled, I'm not saying that I have some sort of moral take, but just the way it was handled, you would say, could communication have been better? Could the optics of that situation have been better? Probably. Maybe they don't care. But I think to an extent it shows what the owners and the people who run the club feel. Now, I'm open to be proven wrong, but ultimately I think their bottom line is the thing that is they're really caring about being impacted. And the level of callousness, therefore, for the rest of the way the club looks feels frustrating to me.
And it's interesting because there's a lot about Man United, and this is perhaps just guaranteed by their size of revenue and the fact they can bring in players every year worth 150 million
and also
quid.
People who, yeah, right.
There's always a lot to be excited about, but at the moment there's this confused glob, and that's why so much of the analysis ends up feeling...
Right.
It just becomes reduced to this is Manchester United.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're splitting the two up and we're saying, well, what's going on the high level and on the pitch, you really have to sort of distinguish between the following. Is Ten Hag at the moment getting it right or wrong? And last year the analysis was very firmly, well, look, they finished fourth and they got a trophy. That's a cracking season. But now 2 games in, we're kind of going, hang on, it looks a little bit wobbly. Okay, so you have to talk about that, and then you have to talk about the issues on the board level. I mean, it's worth remembering.
It's hard.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's worth remembering United in terms of their organisational structure. Mm-hmm. It's only in the last 18 months they have a director of football. It's only in the last 18 months they've thought about transfers any differently to how they did when Ferguson left. And the product on the pitch, so this is now Man United at White Hart Lane, or the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium yesterday, ends up feeling just very hard to analyse. So
hardness should not, the difficulty of the analysis should not put us off wanting to dive in on that. But I don't think it's hard. I think it's opaque, and therefore being able to draw a conclusion from it is very difficult. And the word that I keep getting struck with in my mind is bureaucracy. So the club has become so bureaucratically, I want to say, endowed or imbued, maybe just bogged down. All 3 of those words are possibly similar. It becomes difficult to unpick it, where you go, okay, whose responsibility is this bit? Like, is it the director of football that's responsible for what happens on the field? Or is it Erik Ten Hag? Is it Sir Alex Ferguson sits on the board? The people who own the club? Where's the money coming? Like, all these kind of things. Maybe misdirection's part of what they want, because maybe they're stalling for time. Like, part of me is a bit like, yeah, maybe they are just stalling until they get something right. Similar to the way they own the Tampa Bay Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but Tampa Bay, that team that had Tom Brady, and they won a Super Bowl with him because they brought in Tom Brady and they went, yep, this guy's going to win us a Super Bowl, and guess what? He did. And I wonder if they're thinking we could hit on a similar thing here, where it's like, right, we've got the coach, I bring in a couple of pieces that can work.
Speaking of a couple of pieces, what do you think Ten Hag sees that midfield to look like? I mean, what's his ideal version of that midfield? Because at the moment, he's unhappy.
So he's made Bruno Fernandes captain. So Bruno Fernandes has to be in there. And there's a few moments where I do go, yeah, that looks really good. Like, he plays these... There was a ball early on maybe in the Wolves game and in the Spurs game, where I was like, yep, that's really nice what he's just done there. That opened up a whole side of the pitch. But then, so did Onana. So did a couple of people in that game from Manchester United, where I think it was a ball to Garnacho and he maybe miscontrolled it. But I was just like, that's an outball that I love from that base of midfield. I feel like Casemiro is the next upgrade in that. And I mean that in the most respectful manner. There might be another conversation to have here. Is that the traditional 6, or the evolution of the Makelele role to where it is now, where there is just someone who's more defensively responsible, is that changing now to the degree where some coaches are actually going, we don't need an out and out guy who sits there and does that. Does that make sense?
Well, Ten Hag is maybe the example, because
Klopp also, maybe, the example. You can sell for... maybe that's through practicality. They bought a more defensively minded player and someone who's definitely more defensive, but a lot of people are like, well, we still need a 6.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it, because you have on the weekend Man United getting overrun in midfield.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Basuma was like awesome on the day, and Spurs look really, really good in that area, and United are screaming out for a reinforcement.
Right.
And Scott McTominay is sitting on the bench. He is as close as Man United have to the out-and-out stopper to play alongside Casemiro. And Ten Hag kind of wasn't interested. Now, the question is...
Kind of. Yeah, okay.
So the question is Ten Hag kind of saying to the board, and this was a little bit of the commentary, I need someone better on the ball than McTominay to play in alongside Casemiro? And is he kind of saying, look, I don't need a really defensive 6.
Sorry then, who'd you take out the side? Because they've just bought Mount. At Manchester United, obviously, you could bench anyone you want. It's Manchester United we're talking about here. But you've just bought Mount, and he's playing fairly regularly. And I think he's a really good signing. I don't think he gets to play in the position he wants to. But I'm like, okay, you can't take him out. You can't take Bruno Fernandes out. For me, then, it just goes, well, it's got to be Casemiro that's the player that comes out then. You can't drop anyone else back. This system doesn't work without Antony and Garnacho stretching the play or being the out ball. And Rashford as well. So it doesn't work without... The only player you can take out there is Casemiro for me.
Well, I think...
Right now, at least.
I think the way Ten Hag wants to play is he wants Casemiro +1 in there. The confusing thing about Mason Mount is there's this tension where he's really good, and off the ball you think of him as really good. But there's a wrinkle, which is that he's great at pressing, but you don't really see him as being that defensive midfield player. And if you're going to play him where he wants to play, you probably can't play Bruno where he wants to play.
Well, you also probably then can't play... You probably wouldn't play Garnacho where he wants to play if Mount really wants to play that. And you probably... Antony's doing what he wants. He's getting chalk on his boots. But you still get what I mean, though. There's like a... Because I looked at the heat maps before. All 3 midfielders' heat maps... I was just like, you guys are way too... Look at all your touches just so spread out all over the field. You're doing a lot. Like when I looked at Casemiro's heat map, when I looked at Mount's heat map, when I look at enough of Casemiro, yeah, it's too spread out. Like it's literally just, it looks like he's just evenly spread. Same for Bruno Fernandes, though a little bit more there. Same for Mason Mount, though, yeah. I'm just looking at it, I'm like...
So I have to ask the question then, why do you think, given that United wants to play this 4-2-3-1, and Mount is a little bit wasted out wide and can't really play defensive midfield?
Because I think we're thinking about it in the wrong way. So I can't remember which analyst it was. It was the Tifo guy. It might have been John McKenzie. But he said, when you're thinking of Erik Ten Hag, stop thinking of formational numbers. So 4-2-3-1. You're thinking of the spaces you want people to inhabit. Using a big word, just be in. I think Erik Ten Hag's trying to take them there. And I think there's a bit of maybe growing pains. And obviously you can't make massive conclusions for the rest of the season. This team, I think, will click. That's what I'm saying. I actually think this Manchester United team is going to click. I think the mistelling of the story here is that no one seems to be basically going, they'll be all right. I think they still make top 3.
You think they still make top 3?
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting because I kind of think about United as like this weird, slightly bloated mass where they've got quality players, and Mason Mount and Fernandes and Eriksen is almost too much quality than you need for one kind of role.
Mm-hmm.
But then you look at how Ten Hag wants to play and you kind of think, God, would you not have rather spent the 65 million quid on someone who he's happy with to sit next to Casemiro?
But where's the value in the market? I mean, I know, I find it fascinating. I also think this is interesting is everyone's telling stories about the headline players that could move this summer. Liverpool went for someone from... I keep going back to Liverpool, sorry. But Liverpool went for someone from Stuttgart who was not in the headlines. I don't quite understand why there isn't more conversation around those kind of players at that level. Maybe it's just because I didn't watch Stuttgart really last season, and not many journalists have watched Stuttgart last season. Maybe it's that. And there is enough time in the day for everyone to look at this. There is enough time for you to go, where was the good thing on the weekend? Someone said to me in my comments the other day, why isn't anyone in the Premier League going for Emre Can? Why hasn't anyone just gone, we'll just, bring him in for a little while. Maybe his personality or whatever it is. But he's not a 6, but he is a defensively minded midfield player who's fairly mobile, clearly played in a capable Bayern Borussia Dortmund team last year. There are teams and players out there that are capable of achieving this level. Why are we only going, there's 3 players, Decore, Caicedo, Lavia?
And then to make you a stranger, you have Ten Hag sitting there saying, I'm massively unhappy with my player next to Casemiro. And United going, well, we just couldn't compete in the market for a defensive midfielder. As you say, there's no value. But that's only true, really, if you've decided there are 3 defensive midfielders in the world and they're all £100 million.
And this is what I don't get. If you're going to spend £100 million, why aren't you... what's wrong with your scouting? I'm sure Manchester United scouting, I'm sure there's someone in the back room going... can we please look at this guy? And they're just going, hold on, we're trying to make these guys work. But why is no one listening? The same for, I know Aaron Wan-Bissaka has come good in recent years, or relatively come good. I still think, and some other people are of the opinion, there was a better option for better money than Aaron Wan-Bissaka. You shouldn't have spent the 50 or whatever million it was on him. I'm not saying I don't like him as a player. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be at Manchester United. But I am saying, if you looked at the market at that time, there was someone who was better and more suited to what Manchester United could achieve. And I know they had their 37-player list. It seems like they're going for their analysis. I don't know what the issue is. I know what the issue is there. It's they're overwhelming themselves in the market with data and with these kind of things. And they're going, we'll go for this guy then. And I just look at him, I'm like, what are you doing?
I think the tension is quite nicely revealed at West Ham this summer. So the director of football wanted to sign these players who were a little bit more Brighton-esque.
Right.
They were slightly less known. They had less Premier League evidence.
Pedigree, maybe?
Pedigree. Yeah. And I think the reason, and it's the only reason I can think of, the clubs so consistently overpay, essentially. And I think we can be honest about that. For a list of the same 5 players, because they perceive them as not very risky. They feel like, look, you know what you're going to get from Mason Mount to Wan-Bissaka. And if you look at the Bundesliga, or you go to La Liga, there's no doubt the data will be showing someone who has the second best tackling in La Liga and the 3rd most completed passes. And the clubs are kind of agreeing, United, City, Liverpool, Arsenal, to not go for those players. And the only answer I can provide, and it's almost certainly not a good one, is that they don't want to be caught out by buying someone, perhaps like Jadon Sancho, where they come in having looked great in another league, and then there's this existential worry about whether they'll translate. Because I can't help but agree, if you're looking at the defensive midfield problem at Man United, and there is one because Ten Hag is clearly so unhappy with whoever's playing next to Casemiro, but they're equally happy to spend 75 million quid on an unproven striker, or they're equally happy to...
he is proven, but I get what you mean. Unproven for a sustained period at the very top level where blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I get it.
But it just... in the world of £75 million transfers, how is it possible that Ten Hag is sitting there with McTominay on the bench to try and make a point to the board?
But is he trying to make a point to the board, or is he basically... because it doesn't seem... we said this off camera. He did say that he loved McTominay last season, or he appreciated McTominay at the very push. And now he's been frozen out. Or he's basically being told you're in the squad, but you're not getting on the pitch. It's not a U-turn. I think, again, he's perfectly entitled to make that decision. He's Erik Ten Hag. He's a professional. He's highly skilled at what he does. Is there an element of kamikaze in what Erik Ten Hag is doing? Is he kind of going, look, you need to give me what I want here? Or not?
It's possible. I think about Arteta saying, look, his Arsenal side would develop in 5 stages. I think it's quite possible when Ten Hag came in, McTominay was playing best.
Right.
He was a very natural solution to the problems they were having at the time.
A very also plug and play is a phrase I really like at the moment, but that kind of, oh yeah, you defend.
Exactly. And I think as United have finished in the top 4 and won a trophy, there's possibly an element of, okay, for stage 1, McTominay was absolutely fine. But as we look to be on the front foot and get a little bit closer to how I want us to eventually play, we need somebody who's an upgrade. And what worked in phase 1 of the plan doesn't necessarily work in phase 2.
No, absolutely. And I think this is the thing, is we're into a new phase with Erik Ten Hag here, and Manchester United are coming into a new phase. And I think a lot of what I find interesting is everyone wants to make one timeline. There's multiple concurrent timelines with Manchester United. To an extent, we're still feeling, a hangover from spending that they've done years ago, where there are scars from being bitten by certain people, the Alexis Sanchez type of deals, where it's like, we want to love this guy, but it's just not working out. And then the Casemiro deal was a really solid one last season, but they had to spend a lot of money on it, or a relative a lot of money. You would have thought that there was maybe like for me, it was like they're not buying time, but that's someone who, when someone else will come in, they'll learn from. And I was like, okay, well, where's the other guy now? It seems a lot of their timelines at Manchester United are off. So they get one timeline and it's going, and everything else kind of then verges off around that. They never quite get multiple timelines lined up at once. So they've got a good manager. I actually think this team could play good football. We've seen them play good football. We've seen them be consistent. But then there's these bits where once you start having to lop off elements of like McTominay, Fred, De Gea, you're moving pieces that we can't analyze, because in the dressing room, those pieces are very key. It's why De Gea was so loved at United. It's why, you know what I'm saying? There are unknowable soft elements of these players. I'm not saying soft like they're weak. I mean like soft skills that maybe Manchester United doesn't get analysed with, and I'm not quite sure why, if I'm honest.
It's difficult. I think United are liked for the money they've spent. I think they're liked because they've got one central midfield player they like.
Who's the central midfield player they like?
Casemiro.
They must like Bruno Fernandes if they've made him captain. I think you've got to like your captain. You can't... Erik ten Hag is never going to make Bruno Fernandes captain if he doesn't...
Sorry, central defensive midfield players.
Right, yeah.
So they feel like they've got one of those, but Ten Hag is desperate to play two in there. So they're kind of playing Mount there deep on the weekends, who's not natural there. Eriksen filled in last year. Mm-hmm. McTominay they don't want. So they're light there. They've got one where really they need two or three.
Yeah.
It feels like they've got 2/3 10s.
Yeah.
Fernandes, Eriksen, Mount. And at wide, they're relying on Garnacho, who's a talented player, but he's raw and he's young. Mm-hmm. Then you throw in the fact that they've got essentially a centre-forward who looks great, but's never played in the Premier League before, and is young. And I'm struggling to square that circle and that assessment of their 11 with the amount of money they've spent. Mm-hmm. And it feels like other sides have done a little bit more of a targeted job of addressing their weaknesses.
Or are in the process of. There's a couple of other teams I think have struggled in the market as well. It's interesting because I'm also of the opinion that obviously if you look at Chelsea last season under Frank Lampard, the analysis of that team and the squad, people couldn't really do that analysis because they were basically just going, this guy doesn't fit, or this guy doesn't. And now look at what Pochettino's done. I know they didn't have a great weekend, but that team's way more cohesive. I think Erik ten Hag is Manchester United's bet on that. And I'm wondering if there's an element of, I don't think they're resting on their laurels, but I'm trying to find the right phrase for that. Like the higher ups are like, cool, we've got a guy, he's in control, we're on track.
Do you think they're extrapolating slightly? Where they've gone, well, Ten Hag had a great first year, and of course it'll just get better and better. So we don't have to be so targeted. We're buying good players, Ten Hag's in control. As you say, like slightly coasting, rather than going, Jesus, between Chelsea recovering, Liverpool recovering, Spurs possibly recovering, Newcastle coming again, we need to be very intentional about solving our problems. And to me, as an outside viewer, it feels like United have conflated slightly, buying good players with solving their actual issues. Mm-hmm. And it's not obvious to me they're an improvement on last year.
I think, so personally, I think sometimes cutting can be as good as buying. So not having what is a perceived lack, or having like, not having McTominay in the side is a deliberate decision. At least as I've, maybe in the coming weeks, it'll be like the guy just couldn't be fielded because X. And, selling Fred is a very deliberate decision. Moving on Ronaldo is a very deliberate and public decision. I think that they should be run better than this. There should be it should be Real Madrid that they are being compared to. It should be like the biggest of institutes they're being compared to. And it's very unusual as to why they are not ticking. And the problem for them is now anything outside of top four is failure. And I know people are going, you're trying to put pressure on. It's just the case. Like Manchester United are meant to, as the entity they exist as, exist in that strata of teams. They're almost geared to exist in that strata of teams. So if you build your strategy around that, that's the only yardstick by which you can measure that side.
Do you think winning a trophy and finishing in the top 4
has to be a meaningful trophy? Winning the League Cup or winning the FA Cup is not meaningful enough. Last season, yes. This season, no. It has to be that you go deep in the Champions League and you are closing the gap on that top 4. And it has to actually be better than closing the gap. It has to be that you meaningfully worry some of these sides. Because just look at the squad that they played against on the weekend. It's not all that different to what went before. And the culture that they are managing to build on the field, I think is, around someone like Ange, is very meaningful. But then maybe that's the case with every manager they've had, where there's this new manager bump and then a year later they go, maybe it's not. You know what I mean?
This is kind of the nature of assessing teams while the transfer market's still open.
Mm-hmm.
Some sides, like United, are slightly undercooked in certain positions.
Right.
Other teams like Tottenham, because it's the start of the season, have this like new manager bounce.
Yeah.
And
Maddison bounce.
Who, by the way, was extraordinarily good.
Seems to be really reveling in that role. Seems to be really enjoying playing in a side where it's like, you're the man here. Because they sat Basuma and Sarr, I think, behind him on the weekend. Basuma is exactly the kind of player you want to be playing in front of if you're Maddison. He's almost equivalent to what Leicester had at one point. If you're him, you're looking back and you're just going, cool, hoover everything up that comes your way, get it my way. And he's got great options either side. He can look to Son, he can look to Kulusevski. Richarlison, thoughts?
Richarlison has proven he can play number 9 at international level, but that's appearing to be a little bit of a different activity.
It is a different activity.
What makes it different in your mind?
You're playing against slightly less familiar centre-backs. You're playing in a team where, put it this way, I agree, he's a good number 9. I think just because you're a good, go back to the same phrase I said before about Erik ten Hag. Stop thinking in terms of numbers. Stop going, you're a number 9, therefore you fit that number 9. You can't profile him like that. You can't profile him in the same way as you could profile Harry Kane, in the same way as you could profile Roberto Firmino, in the same way you could profile Højlund, in the same way you could profile. A few weeks ago, put together this profile for Dusan Vlahovic. One or the other. It is itch at the end. I looked at it, I was like, you would rip the Premier League up. And maybe I'm obsessed with him. I saw him at the Turin derby last season. And by all rights, I should not like him. He is a Serbian striker. My family are Kosovan. What he said is utterly offensive to some people within my family. But if I take all of that out, the sporting aspect, I can't help but keep thinking, bring in a striker like that, and you have even more luck, even more facilitation from that position. And I'm not quite sure that Richarlison is quite the facilitator yet. For me, he doesn't quite fit that. Whereas if you brought in a big person who can hold players off, hold it up and get it out. Look at what Spurs did on the weekend.
The other question I have about Richarlison is, at international level, or rather even playing for Everton as a number 9, they have a lot less of the ball. So the qualities that are emphasised are his pressing and his ability to score goals in moments. Whereas the better side you play for, especially one that keeps the ball and is as progressive as Spurs, the weaker elements of your game get exposed. So as you say, he's not brilliant at holding it up. And I mean, he didn't get a shot off, I don't think, on the weekend.
There's too many games where that kind of thing happens to him. And I'm not saying it's his star sign or anything. I don't think it's like that magical. There is just something, and it's similar to the way we're profiling Bruno Fernandes, where it's like when you get your moment, you have to deliver in that moment. And that sounds so broad and so piecemeal in terms of analysis. But there are players who, Harry Kane, all credit to him. I know he's maligned in some spaces as, whatever his mentality is. He's a doer. I feel like there's an element with Richarlison where, over the line, you're going to do it now. It's like, pull the trigger, do that thing.
He also feels like a part-time number 9. You know, you have part-time spinners
Right.
in cricket who can spin and like you'll put them in. But you'd be lying if you said they were your man.
Right, he's not the man, and I think he obviously, you know, anyone given however much money in a contract is going to think they're the man, and rightly so. Like, I'm sure he does lots of lovely things in Brazil, and I'm sure he's a lovely guy, because there are lots of those headlines where he's done great charity. Right, that's good. That's good. You're supposed to, but that's good. I'd almost say if they didn't have Kulusevski or Son, I'd be tempted to say put him out there, bring in another number 9.
Well, I think this is the problem Spurs have had, is they've lost Harry Kane late in the window. There's not an obvious replacement, Vlahovic possibly being the exception.
There are some, but there's not. There's no one where you sort of feel outrageous about it.
Exactly.
And they know there's 100 million burning a hole in that pocket.
Right. And he's good enough to play up front, but not to really be your man. So I think he's actually, ironically, the ideal second striker Spurs have been looking for half a decade. You know, it was hard to bring anyone in because they're going to play second fiddle to Kane. Richarlison as a possible wide option and the second striker is almost the ideal Spurs player. But when you're saying, look, we have Maddison and we have Kulusevski and we have Sonny, who's going to be our man, our fox in the box? He possibly runs into the same problem that Jackson's going to at Chelsea, which is good player, lively, so much to like. But is he going to be your 25 goal a strike season man? And the answer generally at the moment is no.
No, yeah. Because of also what else they're expected to do in that role. And in order to do that, you have to be the moment guy. I think that's where Roberto Firmino is massively underappreciated at Liverpool. That's where, who could you say, other players.
I think about this a lot. How do you characterize the moment guy? Like Gareth Bale or Origi, is it like a skill? Is it something that like we should actually consider an ability, something that people can be better or worse at?
Oh, there's definitely that's a really good point, actually. I think there is a moment element with these people where they have to have a certain level of self-belief. They have to have a certain level of ignorance to some of the criticism of them, where it's like they can hear it, but like Liverpool almost made that into a superpower. It was like, oh, people don't really like you, but we do. Or people don't think you're top level, but we know you're top level, but you're top level at this specific thing. Now look at him at AC Milan. I think he was voted like one of the worst players in the league that season or whatever it was. And there's probably a racist vote in there somewhere. But like, you know what I'm saying? Like it felt like Sadio Mane was that at Liverpool. It felt like Raheem Sterling was like, kind of felt like he felt clutch for City. Gundogan felt that way for City, very much so. He won them the title last season.
Yeah, and the nature of clutchness is interesting because I instinctively first think, no, but like, come on, assess them for their abilities. Mm-hmm. But Didier Drogba's goal-scoring record overall wasn't hugely impressive.
Right.
But then you look at his record in cup finals, and just because clutchness isn't something you could like map as a physical trait,
I want to find that exact way.
No, it's probably a psychological trait, though. You know, it probably tracks some ability to play the game, not the occasion.
Yeah.
Or thrive under pressure.
Or completely play the occasion. So be the occasion person who thrives around exactly that kind of occasion. Like, that's where I guess that, you've got different profiles of player. Maybe they just don't gel with certain kinds of managers. I'm kind of looking at what Richarlison does gel or doesn't gel with. It's not, again, I'm not saying he's not capable, but again, like the heat map here, he's playing so deep. Maybe that's what they want. Maddison's further progressed than Richarlison is on his average positions.
I think sometimes what happens for centre forwards who need a goal, like Richarlison, is it becomes very difficult to just stay on the periphery of the game. And as a result, you end up dropping deeper. Right. I mean, I think one of the things players who go to City, especially wide players, struggle with initially is how few touches of the ball they have for long periods.
Right.
And there's something of an art to being happy and contented to being on the periphery of a game.
You're reassured, I guess, by Pep Guardiola. Like, there must be reassurances at different points where he basically comes over and says to them, you're vital to this, but you're not vital in the sense that other people are going to analyze you being vital. And we know that. Doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. And if you can guarantee success, I think to an extent that helps you. Also, maybe I'm being slightly harsh on Richarlison just to give the flip side of the coin, where it's like, well, they knew Manchester United's right side would be a little more vulnerable with Aaron Wan-Bissaka bombing on, or with whoever you've got. If you've got whoever it is, whoever's out there. I'm not saying therefore that, because there was Delo came in later. I think I remember Saka started the game. Yeah. If you're going to attack that side, of course, therefore, Richarlison's not going to get the same level of love. And of course, they're actually in an Ange Postecoglou team, the striker is asked to sacrifice to an extent so that the fullbacks can tuck in or overlap or whatever, and the same for the wingers. So there is an element of self-sacrifice that when he comes off and he's frustrated, we're going, he's a striker, he wants a goal. Whereas actually, maybe he's frustrated because he's like, I really wanted to play this ball, or I did want a goal, but actually I'm just frustrated with my overall performance, or I'm really struggling in this position. We project on. So when the defender comes off, we automatically go, he's taking him off because he's not defending right. And the manager's probably going, it's about the build-up play, actually. I needed a more solid X here. I needed, you to be more adventurous here. If you take Joe Gomez out for Joel Matip for Liverpool, or if you take Thiago out for Chelsea, people go, oh, they didn't want the old holder. They wanted a bit more dynamism. And it's like the analysis doesn't quite fit because we go, I know what he's thinking. I've got all the insight that Ange Postecoglou has got. And the same for Erik Ten Hag. I look at it and I'm like, I'm sitting there going, I know what Erik Ten Hag's thinking. I know he knows what he wants. He's sitting McTominay because he's strong-arming the board. I'm like, oh yeah, are you? Yeah.
Well, this is where Klopp I thought was so interesting because he used to say about Bobby Firmino very explicitly, Bobby does so much for us. And I always thought that might make Firmino a little bit less grabby with goals, a little bit less worried, a little bit happier to play the game that the team needed him to. And I wonder, if Ange, obviously not unconscious of the criticism, would do well maybe to say publicly about Richarlison, he's doing his job for us.
Yeah, he needs a strike. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, the backing of a manager.
Just to allow Richarlison to just be happy being on the periphery. Yeah, I mean, he could talk. Right. He could probably talk in Portuguese to his compatriots, Jesus and Firmino, both of whom have been non-goal scoring strikers, if you like. And I think, Olivier Giroud at Arsenal for a while was kind of this player who was good enough to lead the line, but never good enough to give you confidence they'd win the league.
No, I like that.
I wonder if Richarlison, just for now in this post-Kane season, has a similar thing where he's good enough to not worry about upgrading, but in the long run, probably isn't the answer.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think in this era as well, when managers are really playing around with positions right now, like that area where it's somewhere between, you basically mark where you used to think the 8 finished and the 10 began, and the 10 finished and the wingers began. It's basically that section right in front of the penalty area where managers are really playing with that right now, and they know goals can come from there. So what does your 9 do in that area to facilitate everything else? Whether he's running out of that area to evacuate it and the ball's coming in, whether he's running into it to overload it. And even if you look at Erik Ten Hag, I remember this analysis when he first came in, they were talking about, don't talk about positions, talk about spaces, right? And maybe those two things are the same thing, just it's a synonym, right? But they were saying Erik Ten Hag loves this thing where if his fullbacks overlap, and I can't quite remember the way the system works, but if his fullbacks overlap, then his 8s or whatever those players are, the 10s or the progressive 8s, have to go back to get the ball back from the fullbacks, and the striker must progress because all the players are reading a pattern that he wants the players to fulfill. I wonder if it's the same with the Richarlison types where they suffer, the Nunez types at Liverpool. To an extent, they've got it right in pre-season with Jackson, but obviously not in the actual games, although it kind of worked with Chilwell in the Liverpool game. You get what I'm saying?
Well, it's interesting. As teams have gone more and more to 3 at the back, the lone striker has increasingly been forced to give up on judging themselves solely on their goal scoring.
Yeah.
Because if they were to, they'd be very disappointed.
The midfield has almost crept up, and the people who are good finishers
have gone wider.
Have had to go wider because the space is no longer there for them to poach, if you like. And that's where I find I keep going back to Liverpool. It's going to be annoying Manchester United fans who click this. Luis Diaz type, where on the weekend it was you're a winger, but you've just popped up in exactly the middle of the area. You've then chipped the ball up to yourself and finished it tight. That is it's not, I don't know, like I'm almost wondering how, like in the modern game, like a Van Nistelrooy would cope. And I'm not saying, I think he would cope very, very well. But I think what's interesting about him is the thing that people wanted him to do, which was a striker back then, was like, shoot from a bit further out, mate. That wouldn't happen now. But he'd just be responsible for little heads off and little chest off and then get into that area where Van Nistelrooy scored a lot of goals. And everyone would be like, all we're asking you to do is just tap the ball in. There's this like the need for a player like that for so many teams where it's like just evade slightly and you're in. Richarlison is not quite that cute, if that makes sense.
He's sort of between things. He's between being that I'll run in behind and score a goal, but his finishing isn't brilliant.
Yeah.
And he's decent at holding it up, but he's not your man to bring players into the game. And I like the point about the eights becoming higher. And it's not free. The higher your midfield goes, the more space you leave in behind.
Of course.
So to make that trade-off worth it, your centre-forward really needs to bring them into play. And it's a rare centre-forward, which is why I think there's such a dearth of top-quality centre-forwards at the moment who can do both. Now, Isak is an interesting example because he's 6'3" or 6'4". He's quick, he can get in behind, but my God, he can hold it up. And I think what we're kind of hinting at is that the centre-forward role is becoming increasingly specialised, but not specialised as in you have to do this one thing really well, but rather there are these 2 or 3 things.
How well are you threading together? Yeah. So there is finishing, obviously, but like you're almost thrilled if someone else scores.
I think most managers in the Premier League, and they might disagree, would see it as more of a success of their system if their striker linked in and their winger scored. We used to joke about the perfect Wenger goal being fullback crossing to fullback. But there's an element of that today.
Oh, yeah.
Where you look at
Keep going.
Arteta and you kind of assume that like Saka or Martinelli scoring with Gabriel Jesus linking things up is almost kind of the ideal Arteta goal.
And that's become the case for almost every top side. Liverpool against Chelsea. I even think Liverpool on the weekend, both Salah and Diaz more progressed than Hakpo, Jota, any of the players who came on. Manchester United here, they have more progressed is Garnacho and Antony. I mean, Antony's level with Rashford, but you get the point. Man City, when they didn't have Haaland last season, wanted like to do a similar thing. Arsenal, similar. There is this attacking trade-off, but it's seen as a trade-off because you're seen as clipping the wings of a striker, but actually it's enabling the other position. And that's where the analysis of Manchester United, I feel, is similar because the midfield is because the roof isn't on the house, the wind is then blowing through this Manchester United team and the midfield's just getting blown all over the place. They've been asked to do so many different things. So what happened, again, I'll go back to it, when Liverpool last season went to Old Trafford and got beaten conclusively by the Erik Ten Hag side, the midfield just got ripped in 3 different directions because it didn't have an anchor. It didn't have the roof on to be able to do that. They put the roof on the house and look what happens the other way, right?
And perhaps it's no mistake that defensive midfielders have never been more valued by the market, right, exactly at the same time that the other midfield players, the number 8s, are so high.
Yeah, because those guys are just asked to bomb on. It's an era where Lampard and Gerrard can play alongside each other.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the average heat map of Xhaka and Odegaard last year,
yeah,
and it's fascinating because if you think about the England paradox, it was, well, you can only play 4-4-2, right, obviously. The other options aren't available. Gerrard and Lampard can't play together, but now what you would end up with is this 2-3-5 attacking shape,
right,
where you'd have Gerrard and Lampard in front of somebody like Declan Rice.
And Rice or Caicedo, or like there's Mascherano back then would have been a perfect player for that sort of thing. Or you would probably, Xabi Alonso would have ended up being, I don't know, where would Xabi Alonso have played? He would have had to have been part of double pivot. Maybe not. The
interesting question I have though is if you think about players like Xavi, who weren't massively mobile, or Pirlo fits into this category, but also weren't stoppers in the traditional sense at all, where would they have played in a 2-3-5 shape on the ball? Would they have been the Xhaka, who pushes nice and high, doesn't feel totally comfortable as a fit? And would they have been the Declan Rice, also doesn't quite feel totally comfortable? And there's this question about like whether the systems we're playing today actually change the types of players that come through. Because we spoke off air about James Ward-Prowse, and it's not obvious where he lives in that kind of shape.
That leads us perfectly towards the end of our Section 1 conversation. We're going to addendum this podcast with a relatively quick chat about transfers, I don't feel like we solved the Manchester United question. That's exactly why the answer is bureaucracy. No matter what the question is, the answer at Manchester United is bureaucracy. Manchester United fans, just so you guys know, and this might be painful, we're with you on this, all right? I don't like your owners as much as you do, if not more.
I like that cutting the red tape is an analogy that works in two ways here.
Right. That's brilliant. This podcast could be all about cutting the red tape.
Dun dun.
I like that. Dun 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 dun. Hey guys, so if you enjoyed part 1 of the podcast, which was sort of like loads of different pieces put together anyway, then hit subscribe on the channel. We really appreciate it. There is like an extra bit of a conversation that we just kind of get into on another podcast feed, which is you can just go and search The Lozcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, and it will pop up there. We will put more long form stuff on, but for now, I think keeping it to within at least an hour is probably a good idea. We want to try and spread it on YouTube. So if you can spread the word of where we're at, let me know in the comments below, and hit subscribe, share it on Twitter and all those good places. And if you do like something specific, we do really appreciate the comments. We will go through some of those comments probably in a future pod, probably in a future section. But we need them to amass first. So thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you guys again right here on the Laurence McKenna channel.